Beneath the autumn harvest, a dark truth waits to be revealed. Welcome to Unsolved Mystery Vault. I'm your moderator Falcon. Your comments make this even better. Where are you watching from today? Now, let's unravel this deadly puzzle. Chapter 1, The Perfect Afternoon. The village of Little Brixham-on-Wold prided itself on being precisely the sort of place where nothing ever truly happened. That, at least, was what people liked to say. The autumn harvest fair unfolded across the green in its usual, dependable fashion. White trestle tables stood in obedient rows beneath bunting of fading red and gold. Jam jars caught the pale sunlight like small, proud jewels. The brass band from the neighboring parish was already struggling bravely through its second hymn, and the air smelt of apples, damp grass, and oversweet sponge cake. Miss Jane Marple sat slightly apart from the bustle, on a narrow wooden bench beneath the horse-chestnut tree. She had been placed there with gentle firmness by Mrs. Ivy Trent, who believed, with touching confidence, that older ladies should be protected from draughts, jostling crowds, and, most particularly, excitement. Miss Marple, who observed excitement with far more interest than most people, accepted the position gladly. She held a paper cup of weak tea in her gloved hands and looked, with mild pleasure, at the village she knew so very well. It was a good turnout. Councillor Bernard Hale stood near the cake stall, laughing a little too loudly at something the vicar's wife had said. His broad shoulders were set back with habitual confidence, and he looked, as always, remarkably pleased with his own presence. The success of the fair, after all, had been largely his idea. At the flower competition table, young Clara Wickham hovered anxiously beside her carefully arranged dahlias. Her smile was too quick, too eager, and she kept smoothing the same invisible crease from her skirt. Behind the book stall, Arthur Pritchard pretended to straighten paperbacks while casting repeated glances toward the cider tent. No one who knew Arthur well would have mistaken that particular look. He was waiting. Near the entrance to the green, Dr. Lionel Fenton was engaged in a subdued but unmistakably tense conversation with Mrs. Edith Bell, whose thin lips moved in rapid, decisive bursts. Dr. Fenton's face, usually placid to the point of dullness, had taken on a strained, defensive quality. Miss Marple noticed this, though she gave no sign of doing so. Not far from her bench, Margaret Hale stood alone. It was an odd thing, when one came to consider it. As Bernard Hale's wife, she might have been expected to preside somewhere, near the raffle table, perhaps, or the prize display. Instead, she stood slightly apart from everyone else, her pale blue coat buttoned neatly to the throat, her hands folded together with quiet precision. Her gaze drifted over the green without settling anywhere. Miss Marple thought, rather vaguely, of a little girl she had once known in St. Mary Mead who had learned very early not to ask for attention, because it had so seldom been given kindly. The thought made her blink and refocus on the present. The fair continued exactly as it always did. Until it didn't. At precisely 3:30, Mrs. Ivy Trent rang the small brass bell that signaled the judging of the preserves. There was a polite ripple of applause. And then, from the direction of the old stone barn at the far edge of the green, came a sound which did not belong to a harvest celebration at all. It was a short, sharp cry. Not loud, but unmistakably frightened. Conversation faltered in a curious, uneven way, as though several people had stopped speaking at slightly different moments. A second later, a young boy came running across the grass. It was Peter Bell, Mrs. Bell's grandson, his face gray with alarm, his arms pumping wildly as he ran. "Mum, Gran, someone's hurt," he gasped, clutching at his breath. In the barn. For one terrible, suspended moment, nobody moved. Then several people spoke at once. "Hurt? What do you mean, hurt? Did someone fall? Are you sure it was the barn, dear?" Miss Marple rose slowly from her bench. It was not haste that made her stand, but something far quieter, a deep, steady attentiveness she had cultivated over many years. The crowd surged forward in a disordered knot, drawn by fear more effectively than by curiosity. Dr. Fenton pushed through almost at once, his professional instinct unmistakable. Bernard Hale followed close behind him, his expression already settling into something that suggested responsibility. Miss Marple walked behind them, careful not to be jostled. The barn stood a little apart from the rest of the green, a low, weathered building with a sagging wooden door that had been left open for children's games and the occasional craft display. Its stone walls held the chill of early autumn, even on a day as kindly as this. Inside, the light was dim. Dr. Fenton reached the doorway first. He stopped. The pause was brief, but eloquent. Those nearest to him felt it, like a ripple passing through water. On the floor, between two stacked wooden crates, lay Counselor Bernard Hale. He was on his back, one arm bent awkwardly beneath him. His face had lost its familiar ruddy self-importance and was slack, almost peaceful. For one extraordinary moment, it looked as though he might simply be asleep. Dr. Fenton knelt. He placed 2 fingers gently against Bernard Hale's neck. He waited. No one spoke. Outside, the brass band faltered to a discordant halt. After a few seconds, Dr. Fenton rose. "I'm afraid," he said quietly, "he's dead." The word fell into the barn with a curious, hollow finality. Dead. Mrs. Ivy Trent let out a thin, wavering sound and clutched at the arm of the woman beside her. Someone began to cry. Someone else said sharply, "This can't be happening." Margaret Hale stood very still at the edge of the gathering. Her face had gone quite colorless. She did not scream. She did not move forward. She merely stared at her husband's body with an intensity so complete that it seemed to shut out the murmuring voices around her. Miss Marple noticed that, too. Dr. Fenton bent again, this time more carefully, examining the position of the body. "There's no obvious sign of injury," he said slowly. "No blood. No fall, that I can see." Bernard Hale's spectacles lay several feet away, one lens cracked cleanly across the center. Miss Marple's mild eyes rested on them for a moment. Someone ought to call the police, Bernard Hale's voice would usually have commanded. Now, another man said it instead. "I'll do it," Arthur Pritchard blurted, far too quickly. "I'll go straight away." He turned and hurried out of the barn, almost colliding with Clara Wickham, who had lingered uncertainly at the door. Miss Marple moved a little closer. Not so close as to be conspicuous. Only close enough to see what others were too busy feeling to observe. The barn smelt faintly of apples. Fresh apples. And something else. Something sharper. Margaret Hale finally stirred. Her hand went to her throat. "He was only coming to fetch the prize lists," she said. No one had asked her. "He said he'd left them in the barn." Dr. Fenton looked up at her quickly. "You're certain of that, Mrs. Hale?" She nodded once. "Very precisely." Miss Marple's gaze flicked, almost involuntarily, to the empty doorway. The fair outside would not stop. Not for long. There would be questions soon. Statements. Explanations. And stories. So many stories. Miss Marple folded her hands together quietly. In villages, she had learned, the most important truths were rarely found in what people said, but in how quickly, and how carefully, they chose to say it. Chapter 2, Whispers Beneath the Bunting. By the time the police car arrived, the barn had emptied itself of all but necessity. The curious were coaxed back toward the green with a firmness that barely disguised excitement. Mrs. Ivy Trent, pale but resolute, took command of the remaining festivities with a shrill efficiency that fooled no one. The band resumed playing at entirely the wrong place in the program. Tea was poured again. Cake was sliced. People ate without appetite and talked without listening. Inside the barn, Bernard Hale lay exactly where he had fallen. Dr. Lionel Fenton remained close to the body, his professional composure stretched thin. A faint sheen of sweat glimmered at his temple despite the coolness of the stone walls. Miss Marple stood quietly near the back, her presence so natural that no one thought to question it. She appeared, as always, to be simply in the way, an elderly lady forgotten rather than dismissed. Detective Sergeant Colin Mercer entered with the careful authority of a man already calculating inconvenience. Behind him followed a young constable whose boots echoed far too loudly on the uneven floor. "You found him like this?" Mercer asked. Dr. Fenton nodded. "Yes. The boy ran to fetch me. Mr. Hale was already dead when I arrived." "No attempt at resuscitation?" "There was no point," the doctor replied shortly. Mercer crouched and examined the body, his eyes moving methodically, the awkward bend of the arm, the unnatural stillness, the cracked spectacles lying some distance away. He picked them up with gloved fingers. "Could have been knocked off in a fall," he said. "Possibly," Dr. Fenton agreed. Miss Marple noticed the hesitation behind the word. Margaret Hale sat on a wooden crate near the doorway, a blanket around her shoulders that she neither adjusted nor acknowledged. Her posture was immaculate, her hands lay folded in her lap. She stared ahead, not at her husband, but at some fixed point beyond him. Mercer approached her gently. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Mrs. Hale. I'll only ask a few questions for now." She inclined her head. "When did you last see your husband?" "Just after 3. "And what was he doing then?" "He said he was going to fetch the prize lists. For the raffle and judging." "You knew they were in the barn?" "I assumed so. He often left papers here. He said they were safer." "Did he seem unwell?" "No," the answer came quickly. Too quickly. He was perfectly well. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her attention sharpened. "You didn't go with him?" "No. He didn't ask me." Mercer nodded and made a note. "Did he mention meeting anyone?" Margaret paused. Just a fraction of a second too long. "No one in particular." Outside, laughter floated faintly across the green, a brittle, misplaced sound that caused more than one person in the barn to flinch. Arthur Pritchard appeared at the doorway, breathless, hair untidily smoothed back. "I've rung the station," he said. "They said officers were on their way." "They're here," Mercer replied without looking up. Arthur flushed and lingered. "You were nearby when this happened?" Mercer asked. "Yes, by the book stall. I didn't see him go in. I only came when the boy shouted." "Waiting for someone?" Mercer asked mildly. Arthur shook his head too quickly. "No. Just the cider judging." He withdrew at once. Clara Wickham hovered next, eyes bright, hands clenched together. "I thought I might help," she said nervously. "You can wait outside," Mercer told her. She obeyed, mortified. The constable finished cordoning off the area. Mercer turned back to Dr. Fenton. "'Cause of death?" The doctor hesitated. "There's no visible injury. No sign of a fall. At present, I can't rule out a natural cause." "And yet someone cried out," Mercer said. "People don't usually do that when dying peacefully." Dr. Fenton said nothing. Miss Marple's gaze wandered, apparently without focus, to the narrow window ledge. A paper cup stood there, the same kind used at the tea stall. It was empty, but a cloudy ring marked its rim. Dr. Fenton noticed it at the same moment Mercer did. "What's that?" Mercer asked. The doctor crossed the barn, lifted the cup, and smelt it. His expression altered, only slightly, but enough. "Apple juice," he said. Miss Marple spoke softly, as though to herself. "How careless. Someone must have left it behind when fetching the papers." Mercer's eyes sharpened. "Did Mr. Hale drink apple juice, Mrs. Hale?" Margaret stared at the cup, then shook her head. No. The word echoed faintly. Outside, the fair went on. Inside the barn, amid the smell of apples and damp stone, the first clear shape of suspicion settled into place. And Miss Marple, folding her hands together, thought quietly of how very rarely accidents occurred at precisely the most convenient moment. Chapter 3: The Village Begins to Speak. The police did not allow the fair to continue for very much longer. It ended not with ceremony, but with a gentle, apologetic dispersal. Mrs. Ivy Trent moved among the stalls with trembling efficiency, explaining to anyone who would listen that of course it was dreadful, quite dreadful, but that people would surely understand. By 4:15, Bunting drooped unattended and the band packed away its instruments in embarrassed silence. Bernard Hale was still in the barn when most of the villagers drifted home. Miss Marple waited. She had learned, long ago, that waiting was one of the most useful forms of activity. At last, Detective Sergeant Mercer stepped outside, his jacket slung over one arm. The constable remained within, guarding the doorway with conscientious solemnity. "You can go home now, Miss Marple," she supplied pleasantly. "Jane Marple." Mercer nodded. "Thank you for your patience." She smiled at him, a little vaguely, and walked away toward the lane. The village, which had seemed so lively barely an hour earlier, now lay in an unsettled hush. Doors stood open. Curtains twitched. The tragedy had not silenced little Brixham-on-Wold, it had primed it. Miss Marple had barely reached the corner by the post office when she was gently intercepted. Mrs. Edith Bell emerged from behind a hedge with the quiet decisiveness of a woman who knew precisely what she wanted. "Well," she said at once, "I suppose we all saw that coming, didn't we?" Miss Marple looked at her with mild surprise. "Did we, dear?" Mrs. Bell sniffed. "Oh, he had enemies, Bernard Hale did. Plenty of them. You can't push people around for years and expect everyone to smile about it." She lowered her voice. "If you ask me, it'll be that young girl. Clara Wickham. She was terribly upset after the council meeting last month." Miss Marple nodded politely. "Was she, dear?" "Cried in the ladies' loo. I saw her myself. Something about the planning application." He blocked it, without even pretending to listen. Mrs. Bell leaned closer. "Girls can be very emotional." Miss Marple thanked her gently and continued on her way. She had gone no more than a dozen steps when Mrs. Ivy Trent hurried toward her, cheeks flushed and eyes bright with something that was not entirely distress. "It's dreadful, isn't it, Miss Marple?" she said breathlessly. "Simply dreadful. And on such a day of all days." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Very sad." Mrs. Trent hesitated. "I do hope the police understand that Dr. Fenton is a most respectable man. He's been our doctor for years." Miss Marple's eyes lifted. "Oh. Well, it's just that he seemed rather unsettled in the barn. But that's only natural, of course." "Of course," said Miss Marple. Mrs. Trent nodded, relieved to be agreed with. "After all, it was his voice we heard arguing earlier." Miss Marple paused. "Arguing, dear?" Mrs. Trent looked faintly startled. "Well, yes. I thought everyone heard it. Near the barn, I mean. Just before the boy screamed." "What time was that?" "Oh, just after 3:30. I was helping Mrs. Crane with the raffle tickets." "And you recognized Dr. Fenton's voice?" "I'm quite sure of it. He has a very particular way of speaking when he's annoyed." Miss Marple thanked her. Very gently. The lane narrowed as it approached the row of cottages where Miss Marple lived. But she did not reach her gate before she encountered her third interruption. Arthur Pritchard stood by the low stone wall outside the post office, pretending to examine the notices. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said. "I didn't see you there." "No," she agreed pleasantly. He shifted his weight. It's all very shocking. Yes. And so sudden. Yes. He glanced along the lane. People are saying it must have been his heart. People say many things, Miss Marple replied. Arthur's eyes flickered. He wasn't exactly popular, you know. Miss Marple waited. He put a stop to the Historical Society funding. And the Youth Theatre. And the library extension. Yes, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. That must have caused disappointment. Arthur nodded eagerly. A lot of it. He lingered, as though hoping to be asked something. Miss Marple did not oblige. At last, slightly deflated, he muttered a vague good afternoon and drifted away. When Miss Marple finally reached her cottage, she found Margaret Hale standing at her gate. She might have been waiting for some time. Her posture was composed, her pale coat still fastened neatly at the throat. Only her eyes betrayed that she had been crying. I hope you won't mind, she said quietly. Mrs. Trent said you lived here. Do come in, dear, Miss Marple said at once. They sat in the small front room, where a pot of tea appeared almost automatically. For a moment, Margaret Hale stared into her cup. I don't know why I came, she said at last. Miss Marple smiled gently. That often happens, dear. Margaret drew a careful breath. I keep thinking, they'll make it dreadful. Public. Miss Marple nodded. They usually do. Margaret's hands tightened around the cup. My husband was not an easy man. Miss Marple said nothing. But he was not careless, Margaret went on. Her voice wavered. He would never have drunk something simply because it was there. Miss Marple's eyes lifted. Wouldn't he, dear? No, the word came firmly. There was a pause. He was very particular. Miss Marple stirred her tea. I expect that can be very trying. Margaret gave a faint, bleak smile. Yes. After a moment, she spoke again. There was someone he meant to see in the barn. Miss Marple did not look up. Oh. He didn't say who. But he said they insisted on speaking privately. Her fingers tightened. He was annoyed about it. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Was he often annoyed, dear? Yes. But this time, Margaret's answer carried something sharper. Not like that. And as Miss Marple watched her across the small, quiet table, she thought that the village had already begun to arrange its suspects. But the one person who truly mattered had just, without quite realizing it, given her the first solid shape of a hidden meeting, carefully concealed, and very badly ended. Chapter 4, The Convenient Answer. The next morning arrived with an almost offensive brightness. Sunlight lay neatly upon the cottage windows and the hedgerows, and little Brixham-on-Wold went about its business with the slightly strained politeness of people who were determined not to be unsettled by a death. Miss Marple was trimming a small spray of late roses when a police car drew up quietly outside her gate. Detective Sergeant Mercer stepped out alone. I hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple. Not at all, she said. I was only seeing whether these were worth saving. He glanced at the flowers, as though the question might somehow be connected to his visit. May I have a word with you? They sat in the same small front room where Margaret Hale had sat the evening before. Mercer opened his notebook. You were present in the barn yesterday when the body was found. Yes, dear. And you heard the boy call for help? Yes. You didn't hear any raised voices yourself? Miss Marple considered. No. But then, I was sitting some distance away. Mercer nodded. We've had a statement from Mrs. Ivy Trent. She says she heard an argument shortly before the incident. She believes one of the voices belonged to Dr. Fenton. Miss Marple lifted her eyebrows faintly. Oh my. He admits he spoke to Mr. Hale, Mercer said carefully. He says Mr. Hale was angry about a planning decision and confronted him near the barn. And were they alone? Miss Marple asked gently. He says they were. She looked thoughtful. And what time was this, dear? Just after 3:20. He claims he walked away before anything happened. And the cry? Dr. Fenton, Mercer explained, had heard nothing. Miss Marple nodded slowly. I see. Mercer closed his notebook. There is one other matter. The cup found in the barn. Yes, said Miss Marple mildly. Very careless of someone. It contained traces of a mild sedative, Mercer said. She froze for the briefest possible moment. Oh. Dr. Fenton keeps the same drug in his surgery. For patients with anxiety and sleep trouble. Miss Marple looked distressed. How unfortunate. We're not jumping to conclusions, Mercer said quickly. But it does make him our most obvious line of inquiry. Miss Marple smiled at him, rather wanly. In villages, dear, the obvious line is usually the one that is most comfortably drawn. Mercer did not quite smile back. He stood, thanked her, and left. The car had barely disappeared down the lane when Miss Marple's gate creaked again. This time it was Clara Wickham. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands clasped tightly around the strap of her handbag. I'm so sorry to trouble you, she said breathlessly. But Mrs. Bell said you were very kind. And that you always listen. Miss Marple ushered her in at once. Clara sat on the edge of her chair. They think it was Dr. Fenton, she whispered. Miss Marple tilted her head. Do they, dear? They were at the surgery this morning. 2 officers. Everyone saw them. She swallowed. He wouldn't hurt anyone. He helped my mother for years. Miss Marple poured tea. And Mr. Hale? She asked quietly. Clara's face tightened. He ruined everything. Miss Marple waited. My application. For the craft unit. He said it would spoil the character of the village. But it was my livelihood. Her voice shook. I begged him to reconsider. He laughed. Where did you speak to him, dear? At the council meeting. And afterwards? Clara hesitated. He said I could speak to him again, privately, if I wished. Miss Marple looked up. In the barn? Clara's eyes widened. Yes. The word escaped before she could stop it. You met him there yesterday? Yes. Just before the judging started. He said he'd come later to discuss it properly. Miss Marple stirred her tea. And did he come? Clara shook her head. I waited. He never came. Miss Marple smiled gently. That must have been very disappointing. Clara's shoulders slumped. Yes. After she had gone, Miss Marple sat very still. There was a knock at the door barely 10 minutes later. Dr. Fenton stood on the step. He looked exhausted. I wondered if I might speak to you, he said stiffly. She let him in. They're treating me as though I poisoned him, he said at once. It's absurd. Is it, dear? His mouth tightened. He was furious with me. That's true. He was threatening to block the new health grant unless I supported his private development scheme. Miss Marple nodded. And you refused? Yes. And you met him near the barn? Yes. And you left him there? Yes. The repetition grew sharper each time. Miss Marple's voice was very soft. Did anyone see you leave him, dear? He hesitated. No. She smiled at him kindly. That is awkward. He stared at her. You don't think I don't think anything, Miss Marple said gently. But when he had gone, she reflected that the village already had its villain. A doctor with access to drugs. A public argument. No witness to prove when he left. It was all extremely tidy. That afternoon, Margaret Hale came walking slowly down the lane and stopped at Miss Marple's gate. "They're saying it was Dr. Fenton," she said quietly. "Yes, dear." Margaret's hands twisted together. "My husband trusted him." Miss Marple looked at her attentively. "Did he?" "Yes. He always said Dr. Fenton was sensible." She paused. "Not sentimental." Miss Marple nodded. "Your husband valued practicality." Margaret hesitated. "He wouldn't have taken a sedative before a meeting. He hated feeling foggy." Miss Marple smiled. "Yes. You mentioned how particular he was." Margaret drew a careful breath. "He went to the barn because someone insisted." "Yes, dear. And they were waiting for him." Miss Marple met her eyes. "Yes." Margaret's voice dropped. "I think, whoever that was, knew exactly how to make it look like an accident." And as she walked away, leaving the small truth trembling in the quiet air, Miss Marple thought gently that Dr. Fenton was proving most useful to the real culprit, by being just believable enough to satisfy a village that dearly wanted a simple answer. Chapter 5: The Smallest Things. Miss Marple woke the following morning with the quiet, persistent sensation that something had been placed very neatly in the wrong position. It was not the sedative. It was not Dr. Fenton's unfortunate proximity to both the argument and the drug. Those were obvious misplacements, like chairs left in the middle of a passage. It was something much smaller. She sat at her dressing table, brushing her thin gray hair with careful strokes, and saw again the narrow stone window ledge inside the barn. And the cup. Not that there had been a cup. That, after all, was quite natural. It was where the cup had been. After breakfast, she walked slowly back toward the green. The barn still stood cordoned off with red and white tape, fluttering faintly in the breeze. A constable waited dutifully at the door, grateful for company when Miss Marple paused to admire the ivy creeping along the stone. "Such a pretty old building," she said kindly. "Yes, miss," he replied. "Does it get much use?" "Not really. Storage, mostly. Sometimes the kids play in there. And people pop in and out during events, I expect," Miss Marple said. "Oh yes. Yesterday especially. Everyone was fetching things." Miss Marple nodded, satisfied. She walked around the outside of the barn and stopped beneath the narrow window. It was set a little higher than eye level. From inside, it allowed a shallow ledge, just wide enough to rest a cup. From outside, it was nothing at all. She stood there for a moment. If a man had entered the barn carrying a drink, he would not have placed it so far from the doorway. He would have set it down near the crates, perhaps, or on the nearest surface to hand. Unless he had already been standing at the window. Waiting. She returned home quietly. The village, however, was not being quiet at all. By late morning, it had arranged its opinions into comfortable clusters. Mrs. Edith Bell arrived before Miss Marple had quite finished washing up. "They've all but accused Dr. Fenton," she said briskly. "Poor man. Though, of course, if anyone were going to have something handy in their bag." "Yes, dear," Miss Marple said. "And it does tidy things up rather nicely," Mrs. Bell continued. "Argument, access to medicine, no one to contradict his timings. The police will be relieved." "Will they?" Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Bell frowned faintly. "Well, they always like a clean case, don't they?" Miss Marple thought of the cup again. After Mrs. Bell had gone, Miss Marple set out once more. This time, she turned toward the row of cottages nearest the green. Clara Wickham answered her knock almost at once. "Oh, Miss Marple. I hope I'm not disturbing you, dear." "No. I wasn't doing anything." Miss Marple was not sure that was quite true. They sat in a small sitting room that smelt strongly of furniture polish and anxiety. "I only wondered," Miss Marple said gently, about yesterday. You said you waited for Mr. Hale near the barn. Yes. Where exactly did you wait? Clara pointed vaguely. Just inside. Near the window. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It's a nice light there. Clara nodded. I thought he'd come in the front way. And you didn't see him arrive? No. Did you hear voices? Clara shook her head. No. Only the band. Miss Marple rose soon afterwards. As she stepped outside, she noticed, lying in the narrow strip of grass beside the cottage wall, a small object half hidden beneath a fallen leaf. It was a paper sugar sachet. Unopened. From the tea stall. She picked it up thoughtfully. Bernard Hale, according to his wife, disliked sweet drinks. Miss Marple thanked Clara again and walked slowly back toward the lane. Her next call was less deliberate. Dr. Fenton emerged from his surgery just as she passed. Oh, Miss Marple, he said, clearly startled. She smiled at him. How busy you must be, dear. He gave a hollow laugh. You can imagine. She hesitated. I was wondering, yesterday, when you spoke to Mr. Hale near the barn, did either of you have a drink? His brow creased. No. Certainly not. And you didn't see a cup? No. She nodded. How very odd. He stared at her. What is? Oh, nothing of importance, I'm sure. But when he had gone, she reflected that a man accused of poisoning another would be very unlikely to forget whether there had been a drink present at all. That afternoon, Detective Sergeant Mercer came to see her again. He looked tired. We may be moving forward with Dr. Fenton, he said frankly. The lab confirms the sedative could have caused disorientation. In a man with an undiagnosed heart weakness. Miss Marple inclined her head. That would be most unfortunate. There's one thing, though, Mercer admitted. We can't quite establish when the drug was administered. The cup could have been left by anyone earlier in the afternoon. Miss Marple folded her hands. Yes. And yet, Mercer continued, the timing of the argument is persuasive. Miss Marple looked at him kindly. May I ask you something, dear? Of course. Did anyone tell you where Mr. Hale was standing when he drank the apple juice? Mercer frowned. No. And did anyone say they saw him holding a cup? No. Miss Marple smiled apologetically. It's just that, it was left on the window ledge. A little awkwardly placed. Mercer looked at her sharply. Why does that matter? In my experience, Miss Marple said gently, people put things down where it suits them at the time. Unless, of course, the thing was not meant for them at all. There was a long pause. Mercer closed his notebook very slowly. You think the drink was prepared for someone else? Miss Marple did not answer directly. I think, she said softly, that whoever poured it knew exactly where the other person would be standing while they waited. Mercer stood. Thank you, Miss Marple. After he had gone, Miss Marple sat by the window with the little paper sugar sachet resting on the table beside her. It was, she reflected, the smallest habits that betrayed the greatest intentions. And somewhere in Little Brixham-on-Wold, a person who did not take sugar had been very carefully removed from a scene that was never meant for him at all. Chapter 6, What People Owe One Another. Miss Marple did not say anything further to the police. She had learned that when one offered too much at once, the listener tended to grow deaf from abundance. Instead, she allowed the idea to rest quietly where Detective Sergeant Mercer had found it, uncomfortable, but persistent. The following afternoon brought rain. A thin, silvery drizzle softened the hedges and darkened the stonework of the village into something almost theatrical. Little Brixham-on-Wold gathered itself indoors, and with the rain came visitors. Margaret Hale arrived just after 3. She looked more composed than she had since the fair, though the effort of that composure was evident. "I hope I'm not becoming a nuisance," she said. "Not at all, dear," Miss Marple replied warmly. They sat together by the small fire, the rain tapping gently against the windows. "I spoke to the police this morning," Margaret said. "Yes?" "They wanted to know if Bernard had any enemies." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That must have been a long conversation." Margaret's mouth twitched. "I said. I thought many people disliked him." "And did they ask you about the barn again?" "Yes." She hesitated. "They wanted to know why I said someone insisted on seeing him." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "And what did you tell them?" "That I didn't know who it was." Margaret looked down at her hands. "That is still true." Miss Marple said gently, "Is it, dear?" Margaret drew a slow breath. "I think I may have known who it might be." Miss Marple waited. "It would not have been Clara Wickham." Bernard thought her harmless. Miss Marple nodded. "He was very dismissive of her." "Yes." "And not Dr. Fenton?" Margaret shook her head. "No. He would have dealt with him in public." Miss Marple watched her quietly. There was only one person Bernard truly avoided upsetting. The words fell softly. Only one person he could not afford to. Miss Marple looked at her attentively. "Who was that, dear?" Margaret did not answer at once. Instead, she rose and went to the window. "Arthur Pritchard." Miss Marple did not appear surprised. "He runs the bookshop and the local accounts. And he managed Bernard's private financial matters." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. "Did he?" "Yes. Investments. Property income. The small arrangements that Bernard preferred not to put through the council." There was a pause. "Bernard trusted him," Margaret said quietly. "Completely." Miss Marple poured more tea. "And did Mr. Pritchard trust your husband?" Margaret gave a short, humorless laugh. "No." She turned back. "He was frightened of him." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Fear can be very industrious." Margaret's hands tightened. "I found something yesterday. While I was sorting Bernard's papers." She opened her handbag and drew out a folded sheet. Miss Marple accepted it. It was a copy of a bank statement. One entry had been circled in pencil. "A large withdrawal." "Was this unusual?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes." Margaret's voice was steady. "Bernard always transferred money electronically. He said cash was untidy." "And this?" "This was collected in person. 2 days before the fair." Miss Marple looked at the figure again. "And Mr. Pritchard arranged this?" "Yes." Margaret hesitated. There was also a message on Bernard's phone. Deleted, but still retrievable. It said, "We must speak privately." "It can't wait." Miss Marple's eyes lifted. "That was sent by Mr. Pritchard?" "Yes." The rain thickened against the glass. "I believe," Margaret said slowly, "that Arthur was in trouble." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Most people who borrow quietly are." "There were rumors," Margaret continued, "of missing funds from the heritage accounts. Bernard knew about it. He had just, not yet decided what to do." Miss Marple said nothing. Margaret looked at her suddenly. "I do not believe Arthur meant to kill him." Miss Marple's expression softened. "No, dear. Very few people ever begin with that intention." After Margaret had gone, Miss Marple remained seated for some time. It was not the financial irregularities that occupied her thoughts. It was something far smaller. Arthur Pritchard waited. He waited for people. At stalls. At corners. By notice boards. He had waited outside the post office. He had waited for the police to arrive. He had waited to be spoken to. He was, Miss Marple reflected, a man who did not like to arrive too early. That evening, Miss Marple went to the bookshop. Arthur looked up quickly. "Oh, Miss Marple." She smiled kindly. "I wondered if you might help me find something. A little book on local wildflowers." "Of course." He moved eagerly, relieved to have a purpose. She wandered slowly among the shelves. "You must find this all terribly worrying," she said. He swallowed. "Yes. It's dreadful. And rather awkward for you," Miss Marple added gently. "With your connections to so many village organizations." He flushed. "I do what I can." "Yes. You always do," Miss Marple murmured. He glanced at her. "You were very quick to ring the police on Saturday." His face twitched. "Well, someone had to." Miss Marple selected a slim volume. "Did you speak to Mr. Hale before he went into the barn?" Arthur froze. "No." She smiled apologetically. "I only wondered. You were waiting so patiently by the stall." His eyes flickered. "For the cider judging?" "Yes, dear." She paid and left him standing rigid behind the counter. Outside, she paused. Arthur Pritchard waited. But not for Bernard Hale. He had waited for the moment when Bernard Hale would no longer be able to speak. And whoever had prepared that small, cloudy drink by the window had been very careful indeed, about who was meant to take the first sip. Chapter 7, A Second Shock. Miss Marple woke very early the next morning. Rain still whispered against the windows, though more lightly now, and the world beyond her curtains looked newly washed and faintly deceptive, like a face after tears. She dressed with unusual deliberation. Something, she felt, was moving toward its own conclusion. It came sooner than she expected. She had just finished her breakfast when the telephone rang. It was Mrs. Ivy Trent. Her voice was high and trembling. "It's Arthur. Arthur Pritchard. Something's happened at the bookshop." Miss Marple felt the quiet tightening in her chest that came with certainty. "Yes, dear? He hasn't opened. I went round because the deliveries were outside. And the door was unlocked." There was a pause. "They say he's been taken to hospital." Miss Marple put down her cup. "I'll come at once." The bookshop stood dark and silent beneath the low gray sky. A small knot of villagers hovered on the pavement with the restrained eagerness of people who recognize the delicious gravity of a second crisis. A police car was already there. Miss Marple was allowed through with gentle efficiency. Inside, the shop smelt of paper, damp wool, and something faintly medicinal. Arthur Pritchard lay on a narrow couch at the back of the shop, the kind usually reserved for staff breaks. A blanket had been thrown over him. His face was gray, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. A paramedic straightened as Miss Marple approached. "He's alive," he said quietly. "Just. Looks like an overdose of something sedative." Miss Marple nodded. She had not expected anything else. Detective Sergeant Mercer stood near the counter, his jaw set. "He was found like this?" "Yes," said the paramedic. Door unlocked. No sign of a struggle. Miss Marple glanced toward the counter. A familiar paper cup stood beside the till. Its rim bore the same cloudy mark. Mercer saw it at the same moment. He closed his eyes briefly. "He didn't drink apple juice either, did he?" he said. "No," Miss Marple replied softly. "He always took tea. Without sugar." The paramedic looked up. "Someone try to poison him?" Mercer nodded. "Yes." Arthur was lifted carefully onto a stretcher and carried out. The small crowd outside parted with solemn excitement. Mercer turned back to Miss Marple. This isn't coincidence. No, dear, she said. He drew a breath. We have the same sedative in his system. Stronger dose this time. Almost lethal. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the cup. It seems someone was not willing to risk waiting. Mercer looked at her sharply. You were right. The first drink was not meant for Bernard Hale. No. It was meant for Arthur Pritchard. Miss Marple nodded gently. He would have been standing at the window. Waiting. Mercer stared into the shop. Someone realized Bernard arrived first. Yes. The simplicity of it hung heavily between them. They walked slowly into the small back room. A half-open drawer revealed a scattering of papers. Bank statements. Miss Marple did not touch them. I told you about the waiting, she said softly. Yes. Mercer rubbed a hand over his face. Whoever prepared the first drink knew Arthur would be there. They also knew Bernard would not normally drink it. But he did, Miss Marple said quietly. Yes. Mercer frowned. Why would he? Miss Marple paused. Because someone he trusted told him to. Mercer looked at her. Who trusted him enough to persuade him to drink something he hadn't asked for? Miss Marple did not answer at once. She thought of Margaret Hale's careful voice. Of her insistence that her husband never drank casually. Of her knowledge that he had been summoned. Of the way she had spoken of Arthur. Of the way she had not spoken of herself. Mercer spoke again. Dr. Fenton is still our formal suspect. Miss Marple's smile was sad. He has been most helpful, dear. In exactly the way the real person needed. The paramedics' doors closed outside. The shop felt suddenly very empty. Mercer leaned against the counter. This attempt changes everything. It proves intent. And it proves a second target. Yes. But it also narrows the field. Miss Marple inclined her head. There are very few people who would benefit from Arthur being unable to speak. Mercer's eyes lifted. And even fewer who could persuade Bernard Hale to take the wrong drink in the first place. Miss Marple walked slowly to the window at the back of the shop. From there, one could see the narrow alley that led toward the green. One must think, she said gently, of who had the greatest need for both men to be silent. Mercer followed her gaze. And who knew their habits well enough to exploit them? Miss Marple turned. Exactly. A young constable appeared at the door. Sir. Dr. Fenton is asking if he may speak to you. He says the officers have just informed him about Mr. Pritchard. Mercer sighed. Of course he has. He turned back to Miss Marple. If Arthur survives, he may tell us who arranged the meeting. Miss Marple's eyes were very kind. I hope he will, dear. But in her heart, she thought gently that whoever had tried again this morning would not rely upon Arthur's recovery. They would rely on something far more reliable. Human nature. And fear. And the person who feared most, Miss Marple reflected quietly, was not the man lying unconscious on a stretcher, but the one who had arranged, so carefully, to be seen only as a grieving witness. Chapter 8, A Gentle Experiment. Miss Marple did not go to the police station. Instead, she went home and made a small pot of soup. It was, she felt, important to do something ordinary. Only when it was safely set aside to cool did she telephone Margaret Hale. I wondered, dear, she said pleasantly, whether you might come and have a little tea with me this afternoon. I find the house so very quiet lately. There was a pause at the other end. Then Margaret replied, with careful composure, yes. I can come. She arrived just before 4. The rain had stopped, and the light through the small sitting-room window lay softly across the carpet. Margaret sat in the same chair she had occupied twice before. You've heard about Arthur, she said at once. Yes, Miss Marple replied gently. How very shocking for you. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. I don't understand it. Miss Marple poured the tea. People are often frightened when the shape of things begins to change, she said mildly. Margaret looked up. What do you mean? Miss Marple smiled apologetically. Oh, nothing very clever, dear. She placed the cup in front of Margaret. Margaret took it automatically. Miss Marple watched her hand. It did not quite lift the cup at once. Detective Sergeant Mercer came to see me earlier, Miss Marple continued lightly. He wanted to know whether I had ever noticed anything unusual about the way Bernard and Arthur behaved toward one another. Margaret's eyes flickered. And what did you say? That they both seemed very careful. Margaret's mouth tightened. They had business together. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. There was a brief silence. Miss Marple rose. Oh dear, I forgot the milk. She crossed the room, deliberately turning her back. When she returned, Margaret had not touched the tea. Miss Marple placed the milk jug gently on the table, just a little too close to the cup. It brushed it. The tea rippled. Margaret's hand jerked back as though the cup had suddenly become dangerous. Miss Marple did not look at her. I do hope Arthur will recover, she said quietly. Margaret's voice came thinly. So do I. He would be very useful to the police, Miss Marple added mildly. There are some matters only he could explain. Margaret's eyes dropped to the surface of the tea. And Bernard, Miss Marple went on softly. He was useful too, wasn't he? Margaret's breath caught. He kept many things in order. Yes. Miss Marple stirred her own cup slowly. Money has such a curious effect on people. It makes them terribly brave, until it suddenly makes them very frightened. Margaret said nothing. Your husband, Miss Marple continued gently, had discovered something awkward in the heritage accounts. Something Arthur could not quite explain. Margaret's fingers tightened together in her lap. And that was why Arthur asked for a private meeting in the barn. Margaret looked up. You told the police I didn't know who Bernard Meeting was. Miss Marple nodded. You said that at the time, dear. Margaret's voice was very steady. I still don't know. Miss Marple smiled kindly. No. But you knew who it was most likely to be. Margaret said nothing. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair. Do you know what I find so interesting? She asked softly. That Arthur was not the sort of man who could easily be confronted. He avoided scenes. He waited. He hoped things would resolve themselves. Margaret's lips pressed together. But Bernard was not like that. No, Margaret whispered. He would have reported Arthur, Miss Marple went on quietly. Not immediately. Not until he had decided how best it might serve him. But eventually, yes. Margaret's eyes glistened. And that would have left you in a very difficult position, dear. Margaret stared at her. You were your husband's beneficiary, Miss Marple said gently. But some of his private arrangements were entangled with Arthur's. Margaret's breath came shallowly. If Arthur were exposed, Miss Marple continued, it would have raised questions about where certain payments truly went. And about who authorized them. There was a long, terrible silence. Miss Marple spoke at last. You knew Arthur would be waiting near the barn window. You knew Bernard disliked sweet drinks. You also knew that Bernard trusted you completely. Margaret closed her eyes. I only meant to make Arthur tell him, she said suddenly. The words fell out as though they had been waiting. I wanted Bernard to frighten him into giving the money back. Miss Marple's voice was infinitely gentle. And the drink, dear? Margaret opened her eyes. I took apple juice from the stall. I put the powder in. Arthur would have taken it. He always drank while he waited. Her face crumpled. But Bernard arrived first. He was irritated. I said he looked tired. I said it might help. Her hands flew to her mouth. I didn't think. No, said Miss Marple softly. Very few people do, at the right moment. Margaret began to weep quietly. He cried out, she whispered. I was still outside. I heard him. Miss Marple reached across and laid her hand over Margaret's. And this morning, she said gently, you tried again. Because Arthur was now the only person who could explain why Bernard had really gone to the barn. Margaret's shoulders shook. I couldn't let everything fall apart. Miss Marple nodded sadly. No, dear. You could not. There was a light knock at the door. Detective Sergeant Mercer stood on the step. Miss Marple looked up at him. I think, she said softly, you will find that Mrs. Hale has something she would like to tell you. Chapter 9, How the Pieces Fit. Detective Sergeant Mercer did not rush into the room. He stepped inside quietly, closed the door behind him, and remained standing where he was. The small sitting room, so accustomed to gentle visits and harmless confidences, felt suddenly precise and official. Margaret Hale had risen from her chair. She stood very straight. I will tell you everything, she said. Mercer glanced briefly at Miss Marple. She gave the faintest nod and withdrew to the window seat, folding her hands together as though she were no longer required. Margaret spoke slowly at first, choosing her words with painful care. My husband handled many matters privately. Payments. Small property arrangements. Sponsorships that never appeared on council papers. Mercer nodded. We've begun to uncover some of that. He enjoyed having influence, Margaret continued quietly. But he also enjoyed knowing where other people were vulnerable. Her voice trembled. He discovered irregularities in the heritage accounts. Not enough to be explained by carelessness. Mercer said nothing. He realized Arthur had been using the money to cover personal debts. Gambling. Loans. She swallowed. He told me he would deal with it in his own way. Miss Marple watched the reflection of Margaret's face in the window glass. And that frightened you? Mercer asked. Yes. Margaret closed her eyes. Because Bernard would never simply report him. He would hold it over him. He would take something in return. Mercer's pen moved. And you were already entangled? Yes. Her voice was barely audible. Some of the funds Arthur moved were on Bernard's instruction. To help certain private developments go through quietly. Mercer drew a slow breath. If Arthur spoke, your husband would be exposed as well. And so would I. Margaret lifted her head. I signed some of the authorizations. There was a silence. And the meeting? Mercer prompted. Margaret steadied herself. Arthur sent Bernard the message. He was desperate. He wanted to explain. To beg him to make it disappear. Miss Marple's eyes softened. But you intervened. Margaret nodded. I persuaded Bernard to meet him privately. I said it would avoid embarrassment. Mercer looked at her sharply. And you prepared the drink? Yes. Margaret's hands twisted together. I knew Arthur would be waiting near the window. He always stood there. He hated being in the way. He liked to look as though he might leave at any moment. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. And you brought apple juice? Yes. From the stall. I added the powder at home. I still had it from an old prescription. Mercer's jaw tightened. You intended to make Arthur drowsy. Confused. Yes. Long enough for Bernard to frighten him into returning the money. Long enough to stop him speaking to the police. And Bernard arrived first. Margaret nodded once. He was irritated. He said Arthur was wasting his time. I told him. I told him he looked tired. Her voice broke. I handed him the cup. Miss Marple heard again the faint echo of the cry inside the barn. He drank it. Yes. Margaret's breath shuddered. I didn't think it could kill him. It was such a small amount. Mercer spoke quietly. But your husband had an undiagnosed heart condition. I didn't know. She pressed her hands together. I heard him cry out. I was still outside. Mercer's eyes did not leave her face. And this morning? Margaret's shoulders sagged. When Arthur was found in the hospital, I knew it would only be a matter of time before he explained why Bernard had gone to the barn at all. She lifted her head slowly. So I did what I should have done before. Mercer's voice was very steady. You went to the shop. Yes. And you used the same method. Yes. She did not attempt to justify it. Miss Marple thought, not unkindly, that people often did not. Mercer closed his notebook. There is one thing I want to understand. Margaret looked at him. You were prepared to let Dr. Fenton be arrested. She winced. I never named him. No. But you allowed the village to do it for you. Margaret's eyes filled. I needed time. Miss Marple turned slowly from the window. Time is a very dangerous gift, dear. Margaret nodded. Mercer stood. I am going to ask you to come with me now, Mrs. Hale. She did not resist. She only glanced once at Miss Marple. You knew, she said quietly. Miss Marple smiled very gently. I only watched. Outside, the lane was pale and freshly washed. As Mercer guided Margaret toward the waiting car, a curtain twitched. Then another. The village had not lost its appetite. It had merely refined it. Miss Marple remained standing at her door for a moment after the car drove away. She felt no triumph. Only the familiar, tired sorrow that accompanied the understanding of how very small a step it was between intention and disaster. That evening, Detective Sergeant Mercer telephoned. Arthur Pritchard has regained consciousness, he told her. Miss Marple closed her eyes. That is good news, dear. He confirms what you established. He arranged the meeting. He was waiting. He never expected Bernard to arrive first. No, Miss Marple murmured. He says Mrs. Hale brought the drink inside. He saw it on the ledge when he came in later. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. There was a pause. And Dr. Fenton is cleared. I am glad. Mercer hesitated. You were right from the beginning. It was about habits. Not evidence. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It usually is. After the call ended, Miss Marple sat quietly in her small front room. The fire had burned low. Outside, the village was settling into the gentle rhythms of evening. But for one house, and one woman who had mistaken control for safety, there would be no gentle rhythms again. And Miss Marple, staring into the small remaining flame, reflected softly that the most carefully arranged scenes were always undone, not by cleverness, but by the ordinary, predictable ways people behaved when they were afraid. The next morning brought no dramatic change to Little Brixham-on-Wold. Milk bottles still clinked on doorsteps. A delivery van blocked the narrow lane by the post office. Mrs. Ivy Trent stood outside the florist's, already deep in low-voiced conversation. Only the slight, collective restraint of movement betrayed that the village had lost one of its own, and learned something uncomfortable about another. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the green. The barn door stood open again now, the tape gone, the building returned to its small, unimportant place in village life. A few empty crates remained stacked inside, and a single leaflet lay flattened on the floor, its bright autumn colors dulled by damp. She stood for a moment at the threshold. It was all remarkably ordinary. Detective Sergeant Mercer found her there. "I thought you might come," he said quietly. She smiled. "One does like to see where things truly end." They walked a little way inside, where pale light fell through the narrow window. "This is where Arthur always waited," Mercer said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. He hesitated. "There's something I wanted to tell you. Arthur will be charged as well." Miss Marple looked up. "Oh?" "He altered the accounts. The investigation has confirmed it. He intended to return the money. He said Bernard promised him time." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Bernard rarely gave anything without collecting something in return." Mercer nodded. "And Mrs. Hale has been very calm since last night." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "Shock can be very restful, dear. It takes away the need to keep pretending." They walked back toward the green. "The case will read simply enough," Mercer said. "Attempted poisoning, resulting in death through unforeseen vulnerability. A second attempt, identical method. Clear motive." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "But it won't explain everything," he added quietly. She glanced at him. "No. It never does." They stopped by the low fence that bordered the green. Children were already chasing one another where the bunting had hung only days before. "I keep thinking," Mercer said slowly, "that if Bernard Hale had arrived at the barn 2 minutes later, none of this would have happened." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Oh, I think it would have happened anyway, dear. Only in another shape." He smiled faintly. "That sounds like professional pessimism." "No," Miss Marple replied. "Only experience." He studied her for a moment. "You never once tried to prove anything. You only placed people together." "Yes," she said simply. After he left, Miss Marple continued on her way home. At her gate, she found a folded note pushed neatly through the letterbox. It was from Margaret Hale. Only a few lines. "I am very sorry to have troubled you. You were kind when I did not deserve kindness." Miss Marple folded the paper carefully and placed it in the small drawer beside the hall table. Later, she sat by her window with her knitting. From there, she could see the narrow lane and the front of Arthur Pritchard's bookshop. Its windows were dark. A small handwritten sign had been taped inside the glass. "Closed until further notice." She thought of Arthur, sitting upright in a hospital bed, explaining himself at last to men who wrote things down instead of merely listening. She thought of Bernard Hale, full of plans and careful leverage, lying very still between 2 wooden crates. And she thought, with a sadness that had long ago lost its sharpness, of Margaret, who had wanted nothing more dangerous than to stop one small collapse from becoming a public ruin. The trouble, Miss Marple reflected, was that people did not understand how easily one secret leaned upon another. Pull out the wrong one, and the whole arrangement fell. The village would recover. It always did. There would be another fair next year. Another set of preserves. Another burst of bunting and forced cheerfulness and small, unimportant triumphs. But somewhere beneath the gentle talk and orderly lives, little Brixham-on-Wold would remember, if only faintly, that it had once mistaken quiet control for safety. Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked out again at the green. Human nature, she thought, never really changed. It only learned, very briefly, to be more careful about where it placed its cups. Chapter 10, The Quiet Truth. The morning air in Little Brixham-on-Wold carried the faint tang of frost, and Miss Marple, as always, took her slow walk along the lane before breakfast. The village appeared to be settling back into itself. Shutters were opened carefully, shopkeepers arranged their displays, and the distant lowing of a cow reminded her that life continued despite the shadows that had fallen over it. Her visit to the police station was not necessary that day. Detective Sergeant Mercer had already concluded his formal inquiries, and Arthur Pritchard had been released from the hospital, shaken but unharmed. Margaret Hale had been in the village quietly, mostly avoiding attention. Yet something told Miss Marple that the resolution was not yet complete. By mid-morning, she found herself at the green again, standing near the barn where it had all begun. Mercer appeared from behind the hedge, notebook in hand. "Miss Marple," he said, "I've been thinking about your observations. About the cups, the window, the habits, and Margaret Hale." She inclined her head. "You've concluded something?" Mercer asked cautiously. "I think we must understand who truly needed silence," Miss Marple said softly, "and who was most clever in using what others assumed to be ordinary." Mercer raised an eyebrow. Miss Marple gestured toward the barn door. "Would you do me the kindness of watching closely?" He stepped forward, and she followed. Inside, the room smelled faintly of old timber and damp stone, as if the building itself held its breath. Miss Marple moved toward the window ledge where the infamous cup had rested. "Imagine," she said, "that someone wanted two things: 1, to frighten Bernard Hale into submission, and 2, to prevent Arthur Pritchard from speaking too soon about the accounts." Mercer nodded, following her reasoning. "The first attempt was an accident," she continued. "Bernard was not the intended victim. The sedative was meant for Arthur. The second attempt was far more calculated." "And yet neither was discovered immediately," Mercer said. "No," she replied. "Because the person responsible relied on what they knew would happen. Bernard would arrive first, and Margaret would intervene." Mercer looked puzzled. "Margaret Hale?" "Yes. Margaret Hale," Miss Marple said gently. "Think back to what she told us. She was frightened of the consequences if Arthur spoke. She knew Bernard would handle things in his own particular way. She did not intend to kill. She intended to control." Mercer's expression darkened slightly. "She tried to poison her husband?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, dear. She ensured he drank the cup to protect Arthur, to keep him from exposing the financial irregularities prematurely. It was her misjudgment, not malice. But Bernard's heart. Bernard was unusually vulnerable that day. So the death was unintended?" Mercer asked quietly. "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "And that is why Dr. Fenton was innocent, why the village was misled, and why Arthur's second incident was necessary only because Margaret feared exposure." Mercer exhaled slowly. "And she came to confess?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "But gently, quietly, as one does when one wishes to protect both the guilty and the innocent from public ruin. She allowed truth to emerge only in the right measure." Mercer looked around the barn. "It's remarkable. All along, the pieces were here, the cups, the window ledge, the timing. And yet no one suspected her." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People rarely suspect the one who appears most frightened. Yet, fear often dictates the cleverest actions." They walked back toward the village green together. The sun had broken through the clouds, shining across the stalls that had once displayed cider and preserves, now empty and waiting for another year. Miss Marple paused. "Life will return to its gentle rhythm soon. People will speak of Bernard Hale, and Arthur Pritchard will resume his work in the bookshop. Margaret will bear her own conscience quietly." Mercer nodded. "And Dr. Fenton?" "Grateful, but unaware," Miss Marple said with a faint smile. "As is often best." A child ran past, chasing a ball across the green. Laughter floated faintly, fragile and bright. Miss Marple watched it, thinking how ordinary life always persisted, even after secrets and mistakes had nearly destroyed it. She turned to Mercer. "You see, dear, the world is made up of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when fear, love, or ambition guides them. And sometimes the quietest observer, who appears least involved, is the one who sees everything clearly." Mercer said nothing, simply absorbing the calm finality of her words. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, settled herself in the gentle warmth of the late morning sun, and reflected quietly on human nature, the fragility, the cleverness, and the unforeseen consequences of the smallest choices. In Little Brixham on Wold, life had returned to its rhythm. But somewhere in the hearts of those who had been involved, there lingered a quiet awareness: the autumn harvest had brought with it more than apples and cider. It had revealed truths that could not easily be forgotten. And Miss Marple, as always, remained composed, observing, and understanding the extraordinary within the ordinary. The mystery was solved. But the lessons endured.